Hey everyone, welcome back to another edition of Your Photo Our Look. We had so many amazing submissions last month that we decided to do another edition of it. In Your Photo Our Look, ON1 gurus and educators like myself take your photos and we edit them to show you different techniques and tips so that when you go back and edit your shots, you have different tools to use. So for this edition of Your Photo Our Look, I chose 2 landscape photos, 2 portraits, a still life, and then a cityscape. So kind of all over the board here. So before we get started here, I just want to say thanks so much for all of the amazing submissions. The photos you guys sent in were incredible. It was really hard to pick just a few, so that's why we're doing this whole other video. The webinar, we included a few of those photos, but there was over 300 photos to choose from. So hopefully a few of your photos got picked. If not, we're going to continue to do this, continue to submit, and you'll definitely see your photo being edited one of these days. Alright, so let's get started with Your Photo Our Look. And I'm going to start with this photograph right here. And this photograph is by Zoran. So great job, Zoran. I really love this photograph. The composition is amazing. We have this boat right here that leads you into the frame with this little house on the rock. Just an amazing, amazing photo. So let's head into the edit module and I'll see what I can do with this really amazing shot. Okay, so right off the bat in the edit module, I think the first thing I want to do to this photo is just crop it real quick. And when I'm looking at this shot, I really love this kind of bottom third area of this photograph. I really love this boat and the water and these rocks here. And I think I just want to include just this kind of bottom 2/3 of the frame here. So let's go and we'll grab our crop tool. And it's already set because I was already playing with a 16:9. So I'm going to use a 16:9 crop here, and watch as I just pull this crop down. It really does an awesome job of aligning this boat with the rule of thirds. We have this house on the rock aligned with the rule of thirds, and then we have all of this nice foreground extra area, and it really plays well with the composition of this photograph. So now we have these leading lines from this boat, leading our eyes downstream. We have this house right here. So I think we have a nice composition. So let's go ahead and hit enter. And now we can start actually modifying the look of the shot. So inside my develop tab, I think for this particular photo, I don't really want to raise the exposure. When I raise the exposure, I'm going to be brightening the entire photo. So if I hold down my J key, I can see up here, this is showing me my true white. And so it looks like I have a little bit of blown out area in the sky. Well, I honestly don't really mind that much of that true white in there. I think it looks pretty good on this photo. So rather than actually modifying the exposure for this shot, I'm actually going to head down to the midtones and I'm going to pull up on those first. And then I'm going to go down and I'm going to pull up on the shadow tones, and that'll reveal a little bit of those darker areas onto the shot. Perfect. So now that we've raised up those midtones and those shadow tones, we're going to have to add in a little bit of contrast. So I'm just going to head down to my black slider here. I'm going to hold down my J key, and I'm going to bring in a little bit of contrast in true black to add in some detail and make the photo not so flat. So you can see by holding down that J key, it's showing me I'm getting a little bit of true black over here in this boat. Perfect. So one last thing inside develop, I think I would just go down into this temperature slider here, and I'd probably just warm it up, a hair. Perfect. So I think that's good as far as just the basic tonality goes for the shot. Not a whole lot needs to be done to this photo. It was really well exposed in the first place, so all we really needed to do was just go in and give it a little bit of a mid-tone boost. So now let's go in and we'll go into effects. And I think the first thing I want to do as far as my effects go is I want to add in a little bit of detail. I think adding some detail in these rocks and in this boat right here would really bring the viewer's eye into this area. So let's go, we'll add a filter. And I'm just going to add dynamic contrast. And I'm a huge stickler for not applying a bunch of detail to water. So I'm going to go to my dynamic contrast filter here. I'm going to invert this. I have my masking brush selected already, so I'll just make it a little bit bigger with the bracket keys on my keyboard. I'm going to hold down Shift and hit X. That's going to change it to Paint In. And now I'm just going to brush this on to my boat, these rocks, this tree right here. Then I'm going to make it a little bit smaller, and then I'm going to brush it on to this little house downstream. So let's go over to this dynamic contrast filter, and I think for the detail, I'm probably just going to pull up on this small a little bit, and then maybe I'll add in a little bit of white boost, and maybe a little bit more contrast. So now if I turn this off and on, there we go. Nice bit of detail, a little bit more contrast down in here. Looks really well just on this area. Because if we had it over here, I feel like it would kind of bring the viewer's eye over to this area too much, when I really just want the viewer to be kind of stay and put in this area right here. Okay, so now let's add a filter, and the next thing I want to do is I want to bring in a little bit of life to this boat area. So let's go ahead and I'll add a sunshine filter here. And I really like doing this if I have a kind of an obvious subject here, like this boat. So if I want to add in a nice little bit of a boost to a subject, so I'm just going to go in here and I'm going to grab my masking bug by hitting M on my keyboard. So with my masking bug selected, I'm going to go up and I'm going to choose a different shape, and I'm going to choose edges. Now I'm just going to drop this down, and I'm going to pull this in quite a bit onto the boat here. And I'm just going to make this masking bug about the size of the boat. Just like that. And then let's feather it a little bit more. Perfect. So now let's go over, and I'm actually going to pull up on this amount, and I'll pull up on the glow a little bit, and that'll bring in a little bit more light into this area. So now if I turn the sunshine filter off and on, it acts like, you know, a little bit of sunshine is hitting this boat area. Okay, so now we've brought in some life to this area on this boat. I think what we need to do next, or at least I think would work great with this photo, is if we kind of tone down the area around the boat. Well, a great way to do that is just to go into your masking options for that first filter. So in the sunshine filter right here, in these masking options, if we view this mask, you'll see that that area that we applied that sunshine filter to is strictly to that boat. So if we copy this mask, we could invert it and strictly apply a darkening local adjustment layer to the back of the photo. So let's copy this mask. We'll go over into our local adjustments tab. We'll select darken. We'll go into the masking options for this local adjustment layer, and I'm just going to paste that mask. And obviously it's pasting it onto that area that we applied earlier, so we need to click invert. Boom. So now it's applying just to the area around. So let's go over, and I'm just going to lower the opacity a little bit until it kind of fine tunes where I want that darkening to be. Perfect. Maybe a little bit more. So now if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, we've really made this boat area pop out in this photo. So let's go over to our effects tab here, and we'll just finish it off with one more filter. So I'm going to add a filter, and I'm just going to add a lens blur. And I know it looks really crazy like that. So let's go into our lens blur filter, and inside the masking options here, we'll paste that mask, we'll invert it again, and now let's go over and we'll just play with the opacity. And if I turn this off and on, just adds in a nice little bit of glow, just kind of tones down that area behind this boat so that our viewers really just kind of focus on the subject here. And one thing I would do is I would probably grab my masking brush, hold down Shift, hit X, switch it to paint out, and then I would paint off this lens blur house. Sweet. So let's hit the backslash key on our keyboard. And voila. I really like what that's doing to this boat right in here. And we can still really see the house right here. And we haven't provided too much. I really like what that's doing to this boat area in here. We can still see this house downstream. Our background isn't too distracting. Also, just great job to you, Zoran. I really love this photograph. Well exposed. Didn't really need to do anything to edit it. I probably could have just left it at the develop settings. So great job, Zoran. Really appreciate the submission. So let's move on here. I'm just going to hit F on my keyboard to pull up my film strip view mode. And let's grab this photo here. Let's move on to a portrait. So this is an amazing, amazing portrait. Peter Knight, what a phenomenal job with this shot. I don't really think this photo needs much editing also. It's a really great exposed shot. The colors are all there. It's very detailed. The background is perfect. The lighting is amazing. The only thing I really want to do to this photo is I want to turn it into a black and white. So let's go ahead and let's modify this shot and let's see if we can't make a stunning black and white out of this already amazing portrait. So right off the bat, I'm just going to crop this photo real quick. So I'm just going to hit C on my keyboard. And I'm just going to use freeform. And I'll reset this. And the only thing I want to crop here is I just want to crop a little bit of this top part. Like that. And then there's a little bit more of an edge on this side than this side. So I'm just going to bring this in like that. Perfect. There we go. That's all we really needed to do. So now let's head over to our Develop tab here. And inside of my tone and color, I really just want to set sort of a basic tonality so that we can go into effects and really start modifying this black and white. So I'm actually going to go into my tone and color, and I'm going to pull down on the exposure a little bit. And the reason I'm pulling down on the exposure is so I can kind of see where the light is hitting. If you pull down on the exposure quite a bit, you can see where the light or the primary areas of light is hitting your subject. So it looks like the face and on this chest here and in his hands is the primary areas where the light is hitting. So let's reset that exposure, and I'm just going to pull this exposure down a little bit. And then I'll go over and I'm actually going to add a little bit of contrast. And then I'm going to pull up on my midtones just a hair. And actually, let's go down and let's pull up on the whites a little bit as well. Perfect. Okay, so now if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, just setting a very basic tonality for the shot because it was already very well exposed. So now let's go into effects and we can start adding some different filters to it. So for this particular photo, I think the first thing that I want to do is I'm going to add a filter, and let's add a curves filter. And inside this curves filter, I'm going to head to my shadow tones area, which is this area right above your blacks right here. I'm just going to pull this down, and that's going to add in some nice contrast to this portrait. And remember, I'm turning this into a black and white, so I'm not really too worried about the colors of this photo, just kind of the tonality. So now I'm going to go up to my mid-tone area here, and I'm going to bring those back by just pulling up on those. And I'm just going just until I get a little bit of those highlights back in his face in here. So if I zoom in right here, I'm basically just pulling up on these mid-tones. So this is obviously too far. So what I like to do when I'm editing sometimes is I'll go too far, and then I can always just go back until it's natural again, which I think that looks about perfect. So let's zoom out here. And now let's go over and watch as I add a filter here. We'll add black and white. And in this color response area, because there's so much yellow on this image, I can go into the yellow slider and I can play with it and really modify the tonality of this image really easily. I can also go up and I can use a preset style, and whatever color is primarily in your photo, so for example, this photo has a ton of yellow, you can go up to your black and white preset styles and choose whatever color is primarily in your image, and it'll set a nice black and white for you. So now let's head down here, and in our black and white, I'm actually going to use a different toner. So inside your black and white filter, there's a lot of different toners you can use in here, and they're basically just split tones that you can use to kind of colorize your black and whites. Well, in my split toners here, I'm going to go, and I really love these coffee ones. I think this coffee one really looks good on this image. And a cool thing about these black and whites is you can go down and you can click preserve whites and blacks, and that will preserve all of the true white and black in this photo. So now watch as I turn this black and white filter off and on. It does a really good job of bringing in some nice black and white. It kind of tones down the highlights in his face. Really looks great on this type of portrait. So now let's go and I'll add one more filter here, and I think the only thing I want to do to this shot is I'm going to add a nice dynamic contrast filter. And the thing about these older shots is I think that it's okay to apply a little bit of detail to the skin in this instance. It's sort of a vintagey vibe anyway, and those old black and white contrasty photos had a lot of detail in them. So I'm going to go over, I'm actually going to pull up on the small just a hair, and then I'm going to pull up on the blacks just a little bit. Perfect. So now if I turn this filter off and on, and we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, and one thing you could also do is we could go in here, and just to finish this off is we could create just a basic vignette. So I'm just going to go in here and I'm going to choose darken, and I'm going to grab my local adjustment gradient by holding down shift and hitting K on my keyboard, and then I'm going to use my shape and I'm going to use center, and I'll just drop this down on his face here, kind of similar to what we were doing with the boat earlier. And I really love this technique for faces, so I usually make it as small as I could possibly get it, kind of right on their face here. And now watch as I just pull up on it. So now if I turn this adjustment off and on, and I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, I think the black and white works really well with this image. And also just what a great photo, Peter. Really awesome job, really well exposed, super fun to edit. So thanks for submitting, I really appreciate it. And let's move on, we'll keep going here. So I'm gonna hit F again, pull up the film strip view mode, and let's go in here and we'll edit some flowers. And in fear of butchering this name, I'm just gonna kind of point it out, but whoever this was, let me open this up a little bit more. Ksenia? I'm not sure. I hope I'm not saying it super awfully, but really appreciate this photo. Awesome shot here. I love the water droplets and the sharp focus on the flowers here. Really great photo. Thanks so much for submitting. All right, I'm just gonna pull this back over. Right there is probably good. Okay, so I think for this shot, I think we just need to crop it a hair. I think we need to remove a little bit of this excess on the right-hand side. So let's just grab our crop tool by hitting C on our keyboard. And I'm just gonna pull in on this side. And I'm actually gonna pull it in and kind of down. And that way I can remove a little bit of this excess on the bottom too. I think that looks pretty good. Sweet, I think that's pretty good just like that. We kind of have this other flower on that rule of thirds. This kind of main subject flower is on the other rule of thirds line. So I think we're doing pretty good so far. And so for setting the tonality for this photo, I think it's really important that we pay attention to the whites in this image and also the colors. So let's go ahead, I'm gonna go over to my tone and color pane here, and I'm gonna actually play with the exposure a little bit and just kind of see where I want the brightness in this image. It looks like the light is sort of hitting this area, kind of this diagonal area, and then this flower right here. So I think what we could do is we could pull that exposure back just a hair, about right there. And that'll bring back some of that white detail in this flower. And then also we have a little bit more room to play with our midtones and our shadows. So now I'm gonna head down, and in my midtones, I'm just gonna pull those up a hair. And then I'll pull up on my shadows just a hair. There we go. Sweet. And I think our photo looks like it has enough contrast. I think when we start editing and we see a lack of contrast, we could go back in, but for right now, I'm gonna leave the black point how it is. But one last thing inside of this develop tab is I'm actually gonna go down to my temperature, and I think I'm gonna cool it down a little bit. Yeah, let's cool it down a little bit. It's a little bit warm. Perfect. So now let's hit the backslash key on our keyboard. Just a nice basic tonality for this shot. It was already really well exposed, so don't have to do a whole lot to photos like this. All right, so let's go ahead and let's add effect. And let's go into effects here, and let's add a filter. And the first filter I want to add is I want to add a dynamic contrast filter. And I want to add it so I add a little bit of detail. And I really like how that's applied to my entire photo. So I probably don't need to go in and mask too much out of this image. If anything, I could remove it from the background in here, but by turning this off and on, it's not really that bad in the background. So I think that works pretty good by just having that detail on this shot. And the last thing I want to do, and so next I'm going to add a filter, and I'm going to add a color enhancer filter. And the reason I'm adding a color enhancer filter is because oftentimes when photographing flowers or still life things in nature, there's going to be a ton of colors. And the great thing about this color enhancer filter is that you can modify specific colors. So in here it looks like we have a lot of greens, we have some yellows and oranges and some reds. And so if we go down to our color range area down here in our color enhancer filter, if I want to modify those colors specifically, I can do that by just clicking on these different color ranges. So with green, I can click on my green, and now watch as I modify the saturation. I can brighten these greens, I can dull them down. I think what I want to do is I actually want to tone them down a little bit. I want to give them a little bit of color, but then I want to tone them down. So let's go down here, and kind of what I've been doing is I'm just going to pull up on the saturation a little bit, and I'm going to bring the hue to more of a yellowy green. And then I'm going to tone down the brightness so they're not so bright in the photo. And what that is going to do is it's actually going to bring in a little bit more of the viewer's eye to this area on the flower because the other greens will be toned down. We could also do that a little bit better by using our color range slider. So with this range slider, we can modify how many or how little of those green color tones we use in this color range. So I'm going to pull up on it quite a bit. There we go. So that is maximizing all of those different greens. So now what I want to do is I want to bring out the color in this flower and in this flower, and it looks like there's quite a bit of yellows. So let's go into our color range here. I'll click on yellow, and now I can play with the yellow colors in this photograph. So let's just pull up on them a little bit here, right there. And I'm actually going to pull down on the range so that it's more applied to the yellow. There we go. Yeah. Sweet. And we'll do the same thing to the oranges. And I'll just pull up on the oranges a little bit. There we go. And then also pull back on the range so it's just kind of modifying these specific oranges in here and in this flower right here. Perfect. Okay, so now if I turn this color enhancer off and on, you'll see it's really brought in a nice bit of color, and we've modified a lot of that green color around these flowers. So now let's go and let's actually modify this so we're just kind of viewing these two flowers and there's not many distractions. And a great way to kind of dull down areas in your photograph is with local adjustments. So let's go over and we'll add a local adjustment layer here. And we'll use darken. And I'm just going to use a big brush size. Oops, that was not my bracket keys. I'm going to use my bracket keys and use a big brush. And I'm just going to paint this in kind of nice and softly around these two flowers. I'm not really too worried about painting in the lines. I just want a general kind of brush around. And then I'm going to go over, I'm going to pull down the opacity, and then I'll pull up on it. There we go. And now let's go over, and let's go into effects here. I'm going to add a filter, and I'm going to add a curves filter. And this curves filter is going to deal with the brightness of the midtones and the highlights. So we're actually going to use this curves filter to just brighten up these whites and these yellows in this photograph. So let's go over to our curves filter here, and I'm just going to go into my midtone area, and I'm going to click on it, and I'm just going to pull it up. Just like that. So now I think we have a lot more exposure into these areas where we want the subject to be. So inside of this curves filter, I want to paste that mask that I used for that local adjustment layer. So let's go into our local adjustment layer here. I'll copy this mask. I can go into effects. I'll go into that curves filter. I'll paste that mask, and then I'll invert it. And then I'll play with the opacity again. And now watch as I turn this off and on. It really just makes those areas that we want as the subject shine, and it kind of makes it look like a little bit more light was hitting them. So let's copy this mask, and we'll just finish off with one more filter here. And I'm going to use the sunshine filter, and let's use strong. And let's go in here, and we'll paste that mask, and let's add a little bit more glow. Oops, maybe just a hair bit more glow. Maybe pull back on the amount. So now let's turn this off and on. Oops, it's a little bit too bright, so we'll just pull back on the amount a little bit more. Perfect. So now if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, we've really just kind of brought to life these two flowers and kind of dimmed down the rest of the photo. So again, awesome job. I really appreciate the submission. I love the droplets, the flowers, the composition is great as well. All right, so let's move on here. I'm just gonna grab this photo. Okay, and we'll head into the Develop tab and we can get started. So great photo, Janet. I really love the shot. I love the light kind of gleaming on this building right here. I love the skyline. I think a really cool thing to do this photo would be to add a more interesting sky into the shot. And I think that might be your intention here because it looks like there's a lot of tonal background that we could use to do that. So really great shot, Janet. And let's see if we can't go in here and spruce this up a little bit. So I think the first thing I would do to the shot, I probably wouldn't crop it at all. It's a pretty tightly framed photo anyway. And we could crop it after we go in and modify the sky a little bit. So let's see how it looks after we apply some modifications first. So inside my Develop tab, I think the only thing I want to do to this shot is just pull down on the exposure a little bit. So I'm just going to pull down on the exposure a little bit, and that's just going to bring in a little bit more detail to this area on this building right here. So I'll just probably pull it down a stop, and then I'll add in a little bit of midtone, a little bit of a shadow boost, and then we'll add in a little bit of white just to bring back a little bit of that kind of oomph in the image. So if I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, all we really did is just pull back on the exposure. We didn't really do a whole lot other than that. So let's go into effects here. So first things first, let's go up and let's actually add in a new sky to this shot. So for this photo, I'm going to add in a new layer by clicking this plus button. And inside the ON1 extras, I'm going to scroll down, and I usually use this one sky all of the time. This sky's 50. So let's use this. I'll hit V on my keyboard to grab my move tool, and I'm just going to move this up. There we go. So if I lower the opacity, you can see it's kind of aligned with the city. We'll raise that opacity. I'll just drag this sky layer below my base layer. And so this is what I tend to do whenever I'm modifying skies like this with a large tonal sky area, is I'll drag my sky layer below my base layer. I'll make sure I have my base layer selected. Then I'll grab my masking brush by hitting B on my keyboard. And I'm going to go up and I'm going to make sure I have my perfect brush selected. So I'll get a nice little brush size here, about this big. And then I'm just going to brush out the tonal areas in my sky. And if I keep this plus button, just where the blue's at, then it'll be more strict and modify the edges so that I don't overlap. And we'll just keep brushing this out until we removed the sky. Okay, so now that I've kind of removed this from the sky area, let's go ahead and I'm going to lower my bracket keys. I'm going to turn off that perfect brush, and I'm just going to remove these skyscrapers here. Okay, so now let's go over. I'm just going to zoom in right here. Let's see if we can't just fix this edge a little bit. So I'm just going to grab my refine brush here, set it to paint in. And let's just refine that brush a little bit. Okay, so now let's go over, and in our layers here, I'm just going to make sure I have that base layer selected. I'm just going to pull back on the exposure just a little bit more. Probably about right there. So now I'm going to go up, and I'm going to right click on this base layer here, and I'm going to select new stamped layer. So now with this new stamp layer, I have these two bottom layers merged together so that I can modify this whole composition. So let's go into effects here, and we can just finish this off with a nice LUTs filter. And I'll go into these black and whites. And let's see here. Ooh, I really like that pyro one. So we'll leave it like that, and we'll add in a little bit of contrast here. And then let's do one more thing, and we'll just do a nice vignette. Boom. So now let's go up, and I'm just going to right click this base layer. I'm going to reset the layer properties, and now watch as I turn this layer off and on. Just a real quick sky replacement just by using the perfect brush and going in and taking out some of those blue tonalities. And obviously I, probably could have gone in here and cleaned up some of the mask edges and stuff, but just to kind of, give you an idea, Janet, on how a sky would look in this photo. Again, awesome shot. I love this photo. I really love how the light is kind of gleaming off this building, and just what a pretty building anyway. So great shot, Janet. Really appreciate the submission. So let's move on here and let's go to this shot. Go in here and we'll go into the develop tab. And great shot, Gary. I love this photo. I'm actually from Montana originally, so this just reminds me of Montana right off the bat. This is basically what Montana looks like in a nutshell. So love this photo. Really like the composition. I love the fence right here and the mountains and the clouds. Just phenomenal shot, Gary. Thanks for the submission, man. All right, so the first thing I'd probably do to this shot is just crop out some of the sky. It's a little bit bright up there. If I hold down my J key, there's some blown out areas up there. So let's just crop a little bit of that out real quick. So I'm just gonna hit C on my keyboard. And let's actually go in and we'll use a 16:9 again. I think that would work. And let's just make it a little bit smaller here. Sweet. I think just like that. Maybe we could rotate it a little bit. Boom. I think that's a pretty good crop just like that. So as far as our develop tab goes, if we look at our levels and our histogram, it's a pretty well exposed image. I don't know if we really need to do a whole lot inside tone and color. I think the only thing I'd probably do is just pull back on the exposure, holding down my J key, just to remove any of that blown out area up top. So just like that. And then we can go in and I'll probably give it a little bit of mid-tone boost, maybe some shadows. And then let's add in a little bit more contrast here. There we go. Okay, so now let's go in and I'll just warm this up just a hair. It's a little bit more warmth in there. And I think that's probably good as far as it goes inside tone and color. So let's go in, and I think what I want to do next, I kind of just want to tone down this area up top. So let's go in, we'll add a local adjustment layer. We'll make sure it's set to darken. And for photos like this where I have kind of a blown out area on my sky, or it's just a little bit too heavy on the image, is I'll just hold down Shift, hit K. That's going to grab my local adjustment bug. And I'll drop this down. I'll just rotate it so that it's actually on the sky now. And then I'll just feather it quite a bit. And pull up here. And there we go. So if I turn this off and on, really dim down that sky area. And we can actually go over and pull down on the opacity so it's not so intensely dark. Perfect. So let's add another local adjustment layer. And for this one, let's go into our local adjustment. I'm going to reset this exposure. And I'm just going to pull up on the midtones a hair. Just a hair. About 10. I'm going to add in a little bit of contrast. And then I'm going to add in quite a bit of structure. So now, with this, I'm going to drop this down. And so if I turn this off and on, see how that provides a nice mid-tone boost in here with this fence. It brings in more structure. And it adds in a little bit of contrast. So I've dimmed down the sky, and I've dimmed down this bottom part. I feel like I've hit the \K on my keyboard. There we go. We have a lot better exposed photo here. We have our foreground more exposed, and our background's a little bit more dimmed down. So now let's go in here. Let's add a filter. And I think for this particular shot, since there's not a whole lot that needs to be done, I think the only thing I would probably add, if I was just being picky, would be a dynamic contrast filter just to bring in some detail. But other than that, I probably wouldn't do a thing. And with the dynamic contrast filter, I'd probably go in here and I'd luminosity mask this. So now I have a luminosity mask for this shot. And we'll invert this so that's strictly applied to the shadow tones. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull over on these shadows and on the midtones. And then I'll remove these highlights. So now if I go back here and I view this photo, all of that dynamic contrast is just being applied to this foreground, and none of it's crunching up that sky area. So let's go in here, and I think to finish this off, I would just add a filter. And I really like how a border looks on this shot. Yeah, I really like how that looks. It looks like a postcard, which it is. Montana is basically a living, breathing postcard. If this was shot in Montana, I'm not really sure where it was shot, but awesome photo, Gary. Yeah, I think maybe one thing I could do just to have some fun with it is maybe add a texture. Maybe use one of these kind of postcard textures, and then so yeah, awesome job, Gary. I love the photo, love the vibe, really great shot. Really well composed also. All right, so let's move on to our last shot here. We're gonna finish it off with this cute little portrait by Michelle. Michelle, great photo, I love it. The energy in the photo, super cute. She's laughing, she's having a good time. Great shot, and really well exposed too. There's probably not a whole lot we have to do to get this going here. All right, so I think the first thing I'm gonna do is just crop it real quick and just crop the top and this kind of bottom area. So I'll just hit C on my keyboard. I'm gonna go to a free form, and I'll just pull this down a little bit. And then I'll pull this up a little bit. And maybe we can move this one in just a hair so that that rule of thirds is kind of on our eye right there. Sweet. So I think we have a nicely cropped image now. I think the first thing we need to do inside develop here is just modify this so we have a little bit more of a separation between our subject here and the kind of the foliage around her. So let's actually pull back on the exposure a little bit, and let's actually add in contrast. So you can see that just by those two sliders, we've really kind of set the tonality for this image. And now we can go down, and I'm going to pull up on my midtones just a little bit, and the shadows just a little bit. And then we're going to add in a little bit of true black. I'm going to hold down my J key. I'm just going to add in a little bit of true black, just like that. So we're just keeping it coming with the contrast. It's looking good. So now I think inside my tone and color, I'm going to actually pull up on the vibrance a little bit. But I'm going to go make sure that I have reduced vibrance on skin selected so that we don't get a bunch of kind of harsh colors on her skin tones. All right. So now let's go in. I'm going to add a filter here. I'm going to add a dynamic contrast filter. And I obviously don't want the dynamic contrast filter applied to her skin here. So let's go into our dynamic contrast filter masking options. And because her skin tone is pretty much the same color as the original color range mask, or the color range mask default color. So watch as I click this and I invert this mask. So now if I view this photo, you can see that that detail mask is strictly being applied to the colors on her shirt and the areas around her, and not being applied to any of her skin tones. So if we view this, I'll pull up on the small, and I'll also pull up on the whites, and I'll add a little bit more contrast. So now if I turn this dynamic contrast filter off and on, it does a good job of applying detail into her shirt and the areas around her. So let's add another filter here, and let's add a split tone filter. And I'm going to go in and I'm going to choose this warm preset style. And one thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go in and I'm going to choose a different mode, and I'm going to choose multiply. So you see with that multiply mode, it's actually adding in a little bit more contrast, but it's still giving it that nice highlight and shadow split toning. Well, I'm actually going to go in and I'm going to balance this a little bit to the right, so it's adding in a little bit more warmth. Perfect. So if I turn this off and on, really does a good job of kind of warming up this photo and bringing in some of those nice colors that we saw in the original shot. Okay, so last thing here, let's add a filter. Okay, so let's make these colors pop a bit more. So I'm actually going to go back to that dynamic contrast filter, and I'm going to copy that mask. I'm going to add a filter. We'll add color enhancer. Let's go to that color enhancer. We'll paste that mask. And let's actually go and let's pull up on that saturation. There we go. So if I turn this off and on now, there we go. It's bringing back that nice kind of blue color to her shirt again. All right, so just a couple more filters I think I would add onto this photo, and the only other one that I really want to add onto is a lens blur filter, and I want to add it on so I can kind of remove a little bit of these distractions around her. So with that lens blur filter applied, I'm just going to grab my masking brush set to paint out, and I'm just going to roughly paint around my subject here. Nothing too crazy, not really, you know, getting too specific with it, just kind of painting around and removing that lens blur from the model. Cool. So now let's head over to that lens blur and take the amount all the way down. And now we'll take it up just incrementally. Maybe a little bit more. And let's go down to our brightness and let's pull that back a little bit. So now if I turn this lens blur filter off and on, really hones in on our subject right here. So now if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, done a good job of just really bringing out our subject and making that pop in the photo. And we can always go over and we could lower the opacity on that lens blur so it's not so strong. And I think also just real quick, one thing you could also do with this photo is you could add a filter and you could add a black and white. And if we click yellow, if I turn this off and on, just what a great black and white photo. I think the black and white would look really awesome with this shot, and then we could actually change our color response and we could tone down that blue. And then we could pull up on the kind of the yellows, and those reds. But yeah, awesome shot, Michelle. I really appreciate the submission. And also thanks so much to everybody that submitted. What an awesome job you guys did. Phenomenal photos. And once again, it was really hard to pick, you know, every single shot. So thanks for watching this again. I really appreciate all the submissions. I hope you learned some different tips and tricks on how to edit your shots. And again, just thanks so much for submitting. We're going to keep doing these, so keep submitting, and hopefully one day we'll get your photos edited for you guys. All right, guys. Well, thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I'm Dylan with ON1, and stay tuned for more.